it turns out in the course of our reporting that we found out that Leonard was putting secret cameras into the karaoke machines in these suites of these hotels and recording these orgies. And we also found out from a very, very good source that China has control of that sexual compromat now, or some of it. And so not only a story of misogyny in the Navy, and also a story of how all these officers involved in this story forgot all their training about being turned by a foreign. Leonard was not a U.S. citizen, right? And he's not U.S. military. So how was he ever in control of so much power?
Did you know that in the U.S. Navy in the 2010s, Navy officers took cash, prostitutes, LV Xiao Baobao, and more from a defense contractor who bilked the U.S. government out of tens, if not hundreds of millions? Tom Wright, the co-author of The $1 Billion Whale, is the creator of the recent Fat Leonard podcast, which tells this equal parts fascinating and horrific story. So I'm currently planning my wedding and am curious if you would be interested in, bringing some of that Joe Low, Fat Leonard extravagance on a budget, of course, to my festivities this coming summer.
Are you actually planning a wedding?
Yeah, I'm getting married.
I don't know how much money you have. I think you're going to need a lot if you're going to. Well, actually, first of all, Jolo's on the run in China, and Leonard is in detention in San Diego, so I'm not sure they're available. But
yeah, I guess I don't really want you. I kind of want them, but I don't want them because that would be awful and horrific.
The point is, both these guys, Jolo, the $1 Billion Whale, and the 1MDB scandal, and Fat Leonard Glenn Francis, the military contractor who corrupted the U.S. Navy in Asia. The key to both of their successes was organizing unbelievable bacchanal for various people. In Jolo's case, Hollywood celebrities and Goldman bankers, and in Leonard's case, the uppermost command of the 7th Fleet in Asia.
So let's take a step back, Tom. Who is Fat Leonard, and how did he get involved in helping out the U.S. Navy sail around Southeast Asia?
So Fat Leonard, I'm going to call him Fat Leonard. That was what he was called. It's not what I'm calling him, for people who are going to write in and say we're being fattest. He was 300 pounds, actually over 300 pounds at one point. He was a husbanding agent. These are people who provide food, fuel, and security to U.S. Navy ships when they're, not at home port. So obviously when the U.S. Navy's at San Diego or Hawaii or at a permanent base, it doesn't need these people. But when it's trying to sail around to places where it's not based, sometimes it will go into a government port, like in Singapore, the Singapore government organizes the port. But in many places, they need a husbanding contractor to do all the work they need to get the sewage off, to put the fresh water on, to get food for everyone. Don't forget, these aircraft carriers have 5,000 people. And Leonard became the sort of monopoly in the Pacific and Indian Oceans for this job. And he became a huge, huge operator. And he ended up living in a $130 million mansion with 20 luxury cars, and he's a symbol, probably more than almost anybody else, of the crazy spending after September the 11th on defense from the U.S.
So what exactly was the Navy paying for when Leonard was providing his services?
So, for example, if a ship goes into a port that is not a government port, and Leonard's sort of doing all the work for them, they need to get the ship. The ship would have been at sea for a long time, so it has all the sewage on it. They need to replenish drinking water. All of that. That's called husbanding. It's an old term from the 1800s or even earlier, which the ship needs its husband when it would go to a repair yard. The ship repairer was called a husband.
Oh, because the ship is like a female always, right?
The ship is feminized, yeah, in the slightly misogynistic terminology of the Navy. So that's the old kind of fashioned term for it. So Leonard came from this family that had done this kind of work, but for commercial ships, which is called victualling. He comes from Penang in Malaysia, a small island off the northwest coast of Malaysia in Southeast Asia. And he goes to jail as a young man for an armed robbery. He's a wild kid. His father, who you'll learn in the podcast, is an extremely troubling, Leonard has an abusive childhood, basically. But he ends up sort of taking over the family business when he comes out of jail, and he builds it. He's an incredibly good networker. You referred to the parties at the beginning. He starts to take out the wives of defense attaché, U.S. naval attachés in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, gets to know them, and he starts to win small Navy business for his family firm. And that's the beginning of a sort of wild rise that we chart in the early episodes of our podcast, where it's almost like a Jordan Belfort Wolf of Wall Street rise. He ends up becoming quite wealthy, and there's always he says there's always corruption there, but he sort of this all gets supercharged after the attacks on the USS Cole warship in 2000 in Yemen. I don't know if your listeners are going to know about that. That's a long time ago.
So what happened in 2000 in Yemen was Al Qaeda basically like took the equivalent of rowboats, filled them with explosive, put them next to a Navy ship, blew it up, and lots of people died. And these ships were designed to fight the Soviet Union in the Arctic Sea, or not necessarily deal with these sort of like insurgent types attacks, and that sort of changes the dynamic of protection when you pull into these ports, where all of a sudden you need to have much more sort of protection on the ground for these small groups of people that may be able to do sabotage type stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I was referring to the mom and pops operators that did this before Leonard. The husbanding agents that were around in Asia before Leonard were small operators. They didn't really have the equipment. And the reason was that the US Navy had this base in the Philippines called Subic Bay, which was a huge base that they could rely on down in that part of the world. But the Philippine government shut it in the early 90s. And so that created this great opportunity for Leonard to come in and to build up other ports that the Navy could go to, including Bali, including a port in Thailand called Lam Chabang. And, after the attacks on the Cole in 2000, the Navy was starting to require much greater security for its ships, not just on the port side, but also in the sea. They didn't want a rerun of that attack. And of course, there were all these kind of Al-Qaeda affiliates in Southeast Asia at the time. There was the Bali bombing, the Bali nightclub bombings that people might remember. And so Leonard starts to provide this thing called the Ring of Steel, which were these steel barges that he would moor around the outside of Navy ships. And
very well branded.
Very well branded. I mean, yeah, the Ring of Steel is a great title genius, right? And so he charged, millions. He ended up charging hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, for that service each time a ship would come in. And so in short order, Leonard is living in a incredibly expensive house, one of the most expensive houses in the world in Singapore, and has 20 luxury cars. He's the only person, apart from the Sultan of Brunei, to have a militarized Hummer in Singapore, Rolls Royces in different colors, and he's making all of this just purely out of U.S. military defense spending. So it's crazy.
Can we take a little detour into that tiny little neighborhood in Singapore where all the fancy houses are? Have you spent a lot of time digging into there's a great YouTube series of like some realtor, because every once in a while these go on sale and they walk around, and there's this idea of Singapore. They have this socialized housing system, and everyone sits in the different blocks, and you're next to ethnic neighbors and what have you. But I do find it fascinating that there is this kind of corner of the island which is just carved out, letting rich people have all the fun they want.
Well, yeah, Singapore's, is interesting because it does have a sort of, Lee Kuan Yew, the founder, did have a sort of a Fabian socialist element to the way he approached things. So there's great housing for a lot of people here. I think it has the highest housing ownership rate in the world, but in the 90%. But then you've got these areas of extreme wealth, and so the Gini coefficient of inequality here is fairly high because there's so many extremely wealthy people. And Leonard was amongst them, but he was considered. So he lives in this area called Nassim Road, Cluny Road. It's right by the Botanic Gardens that the British had built in the colonial days. He lives in eventually he lives in this huge old, what's called a good class bungalow here, which is an old, don't think of a bungalow at all, actually. It's more like the whole thing had been, redone by a very famous interior designer and architect. And it's an amazing, has beautiful lawns and multiple, 2 swimming pools, I think, and overlooking the Botanic Gardens. But he was neighbors to a guy called Ong Beng Seng. And Ong Beng Seng is one of the richest men in Singapore, richest families in Singapore. They own, they have properties and hotel. They own the Four Seasons and the Four Seasons Hotel in Singapore. And I think Leonard was considered nouveau riche because he sort of arrives in this very Tony neighborhood of gated mansions, and he starts to do things like he's quite a religious guy, so he would throw like a Christmas lights extravaganza on his front lawn. Some people would come to see it from all over Singapore. I think he would spend like 100,000 Singapore dollars a year on these Christmas lights, 70,000 US. And, his neighbors were like, who's this guy? Who's like kind of, screwing up the neighborhood, basically.
Fair. Do you know who owns it now?
I've been past it. It looks like it's empty. Yeah. I mean, in fact, he never owned it. So he was renting it, but he was about to buy it. So he had enough money to buy a $130 million mansion. Yeah. Amazing.
Back to our narrative. So, Fat Leonard, he's providing services which the Navy needs, but he's also, ingratiating himself with Navy enlisted folks, officers, all the way up and down the chain of command. Aside from making folks' professional lives easier, what sort of common threads do you see in the vulnerabilities of the Navy folks who ended up playing ball with him?
Um, I guess the thing that's so amazing about this is how easy it was to corrupt the Navy officers. So, we've talked so far about how Leonard did a good job. And I think his reasons for talking to me before being sentenced, which we'll get to later, which is an incredible, very unusual circumstance, was that he wanted to get across the fact that he did a good job, right? With the Ring of Steel, with protecting the Navy, with having, he had 180 boats in his flotilla that would service the Navy, and nobody else was around, and none other of his competitors were able to offer these services. But then what happens is, in the mid 2000s, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan raging, and all these contracts coming in to protect and to service the fleet, he starts to build what we call a mafia network at the heart of the Seventh Fleet. And the Seventh Fleet is the big U.S. Navy fleet based in Yokosuka in Japan. It's the main fleet in the Pacific. It's the biggest forward deployed fleet in the U.S. Navy. And what he does is he focuses on all the people in that fleet who are in charge of things like ship scheduling, supply contracts, those kind of things. And he just corrupts them. And the corruptibility of those people is just fascinating to me. And, he corrupts them with, we started off by talking about dinners.
Let's do a little dialogue, Tom. Let's say I'm the pansy and you're not pansy. Was it Patsy? Let's say I'm the Patsy and you're Fat Leonard. So how would you sort of approach me?
So, they actually talk about this, like Leonard and one of his conspirators, a guy called Ed Ruffo, talk about this in emails entered into the court record. They say, we've got to get Jordan, in your case, hooked on something, right? And so they try to figure out what Jordan's interested in, right? Like, what are the things that you like doing? Are you into sports? Are you into, and they do this with a guy called Michael Mashevitz, who is this sort of American immigrant success story. He was actually taken as a child from Cambodia, from the killing fields in Cambodia, and at a time of great strife and war in that country, adopted into by a U.S. Army official, and ends up commanding a ship, and then comes to Japan on deployment. And they try to figure out, what does Michael Mashevitz need? So, they ply him with prostitutes and, fine dinners. And then they figure out, well, what he needs to do is to go back to Cambodia as the successful immigrant son. And he needs all these flights for his family, for his Cambodian family. And they start to just provide all of these things. So it's very sad and it's very calculated. And it's almost like, Leonard says at the beginning of the podcast that his favorite movie is The Godfather. He sees himself as a Don.
Yeah.
They even refer to themselves in those terms. They say, you got it, Godfather, and all these kinds of things. And they lure in Michael Mashevitz into the conspiracy. And Mashevitz is important because he's the deputy scheduling officer for the Seventh Fleet, so he can decide where ships go. And Leonard doesn't want ships going into Singapore where he can't, it's not corrupt, it's run by the government. He needs them going into ports like, Lam Chabang in Thailand that he controls, where he can fake all the invoices and start to jack up the prices to sort of crazy numbers.
The amount of toxic masculinity from every dimension of this story is just horrifying. One of the other anecdotes, which was upsetting. Well, there are many very upsetting anecdotes in this. The idea of giving these people prostitutes as well as giving them bags to give to their wives, and using the wives as sort of bait to find other folks.
Well, they call it shaping. Try to give gifts to wives so they can give to their husbands to shape them to see if they're willing to come into the conspiracy. We talked to people who were in the Seventh Fleet who weren't in the conspiracy, and they're like, wow, I didn't really know this was going on. So they were careful about working out whether people were willing to receive gifts. And one way they did that was to see if their spouses were willing to receive, Chanel handbags or Gucci handbags or whatever. And some of them were. Michael Mashevitz's wife, Marcy Mashevitz, she's sort of a star of our podcast. She talks on multiple episodes, and she was given a Gucci handbag by Michael, but she didn't know it was from Leonard. And she ends up becoming a sort of very important part of the narrative because she doesn't get drawn into the whole thing like some of the other Navy spouses.
Yeah.
But just to say why this is happening, for people who might be thinking, the U.S. Navy, it's not everyone in the U.S. Navy, of course, but it was a big swathe of people. And I think one of the key things here is that you're away from home for a long time. You're not paid as much as your buddies back home from high school who've gone into banking or whatever, So there's a sense of entitlement, I think, that runs through this story, an entitlement to take those $50,000 dinners, $1,000 a plate dinners, Michelin-star dinners, to take the gifts, to take the holidays. That's really the thing that's running through all of this. It led to this deep, deep corruption in the Navy.
So, Tom, I want to take you back to my 17-year-old self in high school. I was a big Eliot Spitzer fan, the sort of like nerd into like local politics that I was. He was the governor of New York State, who like had a sort of crusader vibe, taking down. He was a former attorney general. He like put lots of corrupt politicians in jail, and then it turns out that he was paying thousands of dollars a night for high class prostitutes. That was very upsetting for me as a young impressionable person who cared about sort of government, and I think it sort of scarred me. That sort of no one is clean in this world, and gave me the tingles anytime anyone was sort of claiming that they were these like noble savior types. I wasn't aware that this was something that could happen in an institution like the U.S. Navy, in going all the way into the Obama era. How much should one index on the Fat Leonard story about Navy culture and what the institution really stands for?
Well, one of the big themes running through our podcast is the misogyny, the huge misogyny problem in the Navy. And we go back to, in episode 3, we go back to the tailhook scandal in 1991, I think, which was when women were sexually abused at a Las Vegas convention. For the tailhook is the hook on a ship that stops the plane. When the plane lands, it stops it falling into the sea, basically. And so it was naval aviators, and they just won the Gulf War, first Gulf War. There was this jubilation. A bunch of the air aviators who'd been captured by Saddam Hussein and then released were there at this convention. Everyone gets drunk, and then upstairs, the women, and this is at the time when women were first starting to fight in the military. They'd been in the military, but they were actually on fighting vessels in that war, and they were sort of groped and manhandled down this corridor, and it ended up becoming a big scandal. But nobody gets punished for it in the Navy, and that's we use that because to understand what's going on in the Navy in this story, and the fact that it's not just junior officers that are sleeping with prostitutes put on by Leonard, it's admirals.
And I love how the admirals, Tom, they say, "Oh, I didn't know they were prostitutes. They just thought I was handsome. They seemed really educated." Like the amount of like, I don't know, willful disillusion, like ego, that.
Well, they don't even admit that they slept with prostitutes. That thing you're referring to is like, if they were prostitutes, they didn't present them to me as such. I mean, that's just it's a rhetorical thing. But the key here is not sleeping with prostitutes, right? I mean, people have their own moral compasses, right? I'm definitely not, what would you call it, a blue stocking or whatever. I mean, is it surprising to people who listen to this podcast that Navy seamen go to bed with prostitutes? Absolutely not. That's what's happened since the beginning of time. But what's going on here is it's becoming like institutionalized, and it's the contractor that's organizing the prostitutes, the guy who's making hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues off of defense spending. Don't forget, defense spending went to, it currently still is $700 billion in the US, right? It went up a lot since the first Gulf War. It was like it back down 2 or 3. I mean, I know as a percentage of GDP, it hasn't gone up as much, but it was, it's doubled since before the first Gulf War. And Leonard's making all this money, and one of the keys to him winning the contracts is he's putting on all these. Sometimes it's single prostitutes. Sometimes he's organizing orgies. The podcast begins with him organizing an orgy in the Manila Hotel, where Douglas MacArthur had been during the Second World War, famous general. And there's also a huge, I mean, not only is it a culture of misogyny in the Navy, how are women going to fit in with a culture where this is happening with senior officers?
Yeah.
It's also a massive national security risk because, it turns out in the course of our reporting that we found out that Leonard was putting secret cameras into the karaoke machines in these suites of these hotels and recording these orgies. And so, we also found out from a very, very good source that China has control of that sexual compromat now, or some of it. And so, not only a story of misogyny in the Navy, and also a story of how all these officers involved in this story forgot all their training about being turned by a foreign. Leonard was not a U.S. citizen, right? And he's not U.S. military. So how was he ever in control of so much power? He can decide where warships go because he's corrupted the supply guys and the scheduling guys, and then he's got all this kind of leverage on them from all the sexual antics that everyone got up to.
So let's take this story forward a little bit, Tom. How does the Navy and then ultimately DOJ and the FBI start to wrap this up? And what has been the Navy's response to all of the dirty laundry which has been aired over the past few years?
So you may, if you're listening to this, and this is a world that we're peeling back the curtain on, right? People don't really know about this world. You're probably thinking, well, how the hell did this continue for so long? How is this guy ripping off the U.S. Navy for so long? Part of the reason is that people did make complaints. We talked to a whistleblower called David Schaus in one of the episodes, and he's in Hong Kong, and he complains about, these high costs. Why is Leonard charging for 40,000 liters of fresh water when the boat can only take half of that, or whatever it is, right? And they get ignored. They make complaints to the NCIS, which is the Naval Investigative Body, famous because of the TV show with LL Cool J, right? And none of these NCIS investigations go anywhere. And one of the reasons is that Leonard is doing such a good job. We talked about the Ring of Steel. We talked about all these boats he had. No one could really replicate what he was doing. And also everyone's getting laid and having dinners and parties in every port. And by the way, Leonard's also got a warship called the Braveheart, which he bought it was an old British warship that he buys. He even uses that to fuel Marines on missions to fight Al-Qaeda in the Philippines. So he's doing this great job. And the NCIS investigations all get ignored. And we never really understood because Leonard got arrested, in 2013 in San Diego. But the Navy has never really explained what happened because it's such an embarrassment, this whole story. But we were able to understand through our reporting the sequence of events that led to Leonard's arrest. The NCIS ignores these investigations for so many years. But then Marcy Maszewicz, who we referred to earlier, the wife of Commander Michael Maszewicz, who'd been corrupted by Leonard, Michael ends up abusing her, pushing her up the stairs. She has a bruise. She ends up taking it to the 7th Fleet Command, and Michael's put on the ship to prevent, to keep him away from the family, which is living in a house on the base there in Japan. And eventually she gets sick of she knows Michael's has having affairs, that he's hanging out with Leonard. He even sort of takes their 4 children, some of their 4 children to parties with Leonard, not parties, dinners with Leonard. And Marcy ends up going to the NCIS with her concerns about her husband. And she talks about the gift, the Gucci handbag that she got. She talks about, she hands over emails, credit card statements, all this kind of thing. And they start looking into Michael Maszewicz. The NCIS does finally. And they start to see they look at his Gmail account, not just his formal Navy account. And they see that he's doing all this sort of dodgy dealings with Leonard, including, Michael's in charge of ship movements or can help change the movements of ships. And so he's helping Leonard get ships to ports that Leonard controls. And that's really by that point, this is already at Washington at the level of, Quantico, at the level of NCIS headquarters. And this investigation ends up getting sort of an unstoppable momentum that Leonard can't control anymore.
Hi, I'm Callum Quinn, China Talks editor. I clean up these shows so you don't have to hear all Jordan's attempts to pronounce people's names correctly. Help pay my salary and get an ad-free feed for your trouble by subscribing to China Talk. Links in the show notes. And don't forget, we also have a Substack where you can find transcripts of episodes, as well as guest posts from experts and translations of Chinese media coverage of international events. Link also in the show notes.
Tom, have you read Red Roulette?
I have. Wonderful.
Okay. So how would you compare and contrast Fat Leonard and the Red Roulette protagonist?
So, I mean, the red roulette, I mean, I'm not a Chinese speaker, but the red roulette protagonist that you're referring to is
Desmond Shum.
Desmond Shum and mainly his wife, who, they were effectively bag men and women for Prime Minister of China, Wen Jiabao, and his wife, right? The Prime Minister's wife. And, that was, in some ways, I picked up the book, I'd read all of David Barbosa's coverage in the New York Times, and I knew about the corruption and Wen Jiabao's corruption and the fact that it had gotten, the Times in trouble in China and foreign journalists sort of blocked there. But I was shocked by the detail in that book of how the life of a bag man and a bag woman for a major head of state, how it works. And it was such a great book because, if you're not a China expert like me, you read a lot of China books and they don't have that level of inside the room that book had.
Yeah.
I have questions about, at the end he talks about he moved to America because he believes in democracy, and you do end up feeling, well, it's a little bit late for that. But if you compare it to Leonard, I'd say it's different. Leonard, Leonard definitely did a good job in some ways, right? He did provide a lot of things the Navy needed to operate and made it easy for the Navy to operate for a long time. So, for example, the Navy wants to go to Chennai in India. They want to have the first ever aircraft carrier visit to an Indian port, and they can't really find anyone in India that's up to their standards. And so Leonard sails all these ships across from Singapore, distance of like New York City to Denver, Colorado, and protects the ships and brings all the things they need. And he ends up charging $5 million. So that's the ripoff part, right? But he's doing a real job. Whereas in the case of Red Roulette, I mean, I wasn't, they build that sort of city that they're planning to do and all this, but I'm not really sure of where the economic or business good is in the Red Roulette story.
Yeah.
If you get what I'm saying. Do
you
know what I mean?
My other sort of comparison is that, like, Desmond, at some point, he realizes that this is all stupid and fake, and that this is just like actually a kind of gross game. And the way he frames it, at least, is that he kind of wanted to go clean and just like be able to like be a businessman and like do private equity shit. Fat Leonard seems like a psychopath, who clearly had this like very traumatic childhood, which he's keeping with him, and he's doing horrible things to his former the parents of his children. And while at the other hand, I think Desmond like actually sort of knows how to relate to human beings in a somewhat more healthy way, which was my big takeaway. But I think, sorry.
No, of course that's true. So I mean, the big difference is that Desmond Shum's written a tell-all book about the utter corruption at the heart of the Chinese political system, which is incredibly useful to everyone who's read it, because who else is in a position to do that? I mean, it's a fascinating book. I mean, when I went to buy it in Singapore, it was like there was so many copies on reserve in Kinokuniya that people wanted to buy it, right? And I think I read it like as soon as it came out because I was so fascinated by it. But he's playing a service and I imagine quite large personal risk to tell the story. And so, yes, it's amazing. And Leonard, of course. So why did Leonard agree to talk to me? Leonard was arrested in 2013 in a sting in San Diego. They pretended they were calling him in to discuss more contracts, and they ended up arresting him in the Marriott Hotel in San Diego 8 years ago. And he's been cooperating ever since with the government as a star witness in the case of all the other Navy officers who were corrupted by him, who are still ongoing. And a bunch of those, 6 of those, are going to trial in February because they've pleaded not guilty. So Leonard has no guilt at all. He talking to me is not really, I mean, it is a tell-all in the sense that he admits to all the corruption in the same way that Desmond Shum writes about the corruption in his book.
Yeah.
But whereas Desmond Shum is sort of saying, well, it was all terrible and this is just bad. Leonard sort of tries to spin it that, well, I did a great job. This corruption is necessary to get anything happening. And he's sort of, it's not a mea culpa at all. But it's amazing that he decided to talk, Leonard, for this podcast, because it's not good for him. He has not yet been sentenced.
Yeah.
The government will be very angry with him now this podcast has come out. And By the way, he's got kidney cancer, so that's another reason that he may have decided to talk. That he's not in good health, and so he threw caution to the wind to do the podcast.
What was sort of your like emotional valence over the course of doing these interviews?
Well, Leonard is a fascinating character. He's very charming on some levels. When you're talking to him, and so as you listen to the podcast, you'll be charmed by him. I think at some point you'll sort of almost be rooting for him when he, like this Wolf of Wall Street like rise that he has earlier on in the series.
I wasn't rooting for him, Tom.
You weren't really, maybe not. I mean, yes, at least okay. I think what you could say is at least you don't hate him at the early stages. But what happened to me was in my 25 hours of talking to him on, like we're talking now on this Riverside product here, we did a very similar thing. He recorded, we sort of smuggled in a microphone. He's out on home detention because he has cancer. So we smuggled in his microphone, he set it up, and we talked. As I did my own research about him, it's obviously we don't allow him just to talk and tell his story, but everything was sort of second sourced or worked out against reality. And he, I started to find out things about his personal cruelties to women, including the mother of his children, Marcy Mashevitz as well. And I started to, really have problem with this guy. And he talks very openly in a misogynistic way. He talks about how the mother of his child was just a mistress who he fired. He uses language like that. It all goes back to his own extremely abusive childhood. And I had to sort of just keep the interviews going, even though I was personally troubled by my what I was learning about him as we were going ahead.
Yeah. So I did a show with Lizzie and Mike Forsyth, kind of as a little book club, talking about Red Roulette. And one point that Mike made was just that Chinese journalists, if they were allowed to dig around, the amount of stuff that the amount of comparable stories that they would be able to find, not just in the PLA, of course, but like across the entire system, would just be horrifying. And it's fascinating, right? Because you get these little glimpses every once in a while. Over the course of the anti-corruption campaign in particular, you had these short trials, and sometimes people would say, like, sometimes there would be some incentive within the system to like show the fridge full of cash or like have some sort of salacious details. But you would never get the like, what does this mean about the institution, and how was this one person able to be this corrupt and get all this money in the first place, right? So it's interesting thinking about to what extent this is clearly this is not only something that's happening in America, and it almost certainly is even more gross. We just had Peng Shuai, right? The number 4 on the state council is pressuring tennis stars to sleep with him. So
yeah, no, I think okay. So I mean, China clearly. I mean, I lived in Hong Kong for a bunch of years, but I'm no China expert. I don't speak Chinese, and I don't pretend to know what's going on in the mainland. I think it's just a black box for so many people. But Mike Forsyth would be close of all the people watching China and knowing about corruption. He's the one who really does the hard yards, looking at the gravestones to find who owns what on family characters and all that kind of amazing work they do at the New York Times. That great story they did last year proving that I think the number 2 in the party had houses down in Stanley in Hong Kong,
yeah.
Riverfront, multi-million dollar houses and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, the corruption in China is obviously not, it's well known and it's very, very deep. My personal knowledge of it is that, Jolo, the fraudster at the center of the 1MDB scandal, when he was on the run, where is he living now? Well, he's living in China. And the reason is that he went there after he was exposed in newspaper articles and was given some level of protection by a guy called Sun Lijun. And Sun Lijun was the head of the domestic security forces in China at the time, a pretty, I think a vice minister level. And Sun and Jolo got involved in corrupt Belt and Road deals in Malaysia. And it was an attempt to pad these rail contracts in Malaysia and fill the holes from the earlier frauds. And, Sun Lijun was going to make his money. Now, we know about this because somebody on the Malaysian side of this took minutes of a meeting in Beijing in 2016 where they discuss all these corrupt Belt and Road deals they're going to do. And they discuss it in very bold terms. They say, well, we should need to jack up the price here and make it look commercial over here, and we'll take the money from this. And until today, I think it's one of the clearest sort of examples of corruption in the Belt and Road. And if people don't know what that is, that's like China building rail and road overseas. We got hold of those minutes because when the Prime Minister of Malaysia lost his position and the opposition came in, they got those minutes and somebody leaked them to us. And subsequently, Sun Lijun, Jolo's protector in China, has been arrested for corruption by the Xi Jinping administration. And I think recently he was kicked out of the Communist Party, and he's like, I don't know, I imagine he's going to be punished pretty severely. But it's just that in China, I think, are these anti-corruption drives real? I don't think so. This is just somebody got caught and, gets publicized, but Jolo still hasn't been returned to face justice in America or Malaysia.
So there were two dynamics of the response by the Navy. First, you have this dynamic of different spanks for different ranks, where the more junior folks who were, to a greater or lesser extent involved with Fat Leonard, ended up going to jail. And more senior folks, got kind of letters in their system or whatever, were able to retire with full retirement benefits and so on. Also, you had this just broader lack of a reckoning, it seems, for what ended up happening. So, slightly facetiously, Tom, does the U.S. government need an anti-corruption drive?
Well, look, I mean, let's just say I don't in any way believe that the U.S. system is as corrupt as the Chinese system. That would be my view. But yes, I mean, I'm a journalist. I believe that you need to let in sunlight, for things to get better. And the U.S. Navy clearly has a corruption problem. Is everyone in the U.S. Navy corrupt? No, that's not what we're saying. But Leonard was telling me throughout this whole, 25 hours of talking, he kept saying, of course it's corrupt. And look, by the way, the person who took over my contracts, a company called MLS, is also corrupt. And I sort of discounted it. I had no time to go investigate that. I wasn't going to use that in the podcast. And how do you check? It would have been a whole new investigation. I would have to open up into a different company that was currently still doing anything. And then, a few weeks ago, there's an indictment for the arrest of the CEO of MLS, unsealed from Washington. And that guy's now been arrested, turned himself in, and he's been arrested. And so, and it looks just like the Fat Leonard scandal. It involves officials taking bribes, over invoicing, charging too much for his services, Navy officials taking backhanders. And so it happens. Is it everyone in the Navy? No. But again, it's happening, and it's a problem. And the other problem is you alluded to is that after Leonard was arrested, okay, so 30 people, more or less 30 Navy officers, almost 30 Navy officers has been indicted, right? Some of them pled guilty and went to jail. Others' trials, as I said, are coming up in the ones who've pleaded not guilty. I think it's 6 now who have pleaded not guilty. They're going to trial in February with Leonard as a star witness, after which he'll be sentenced, right? So this has gone on and on and on. And meanwhile, all the admirals that were involved with Leonard, the 4-stars admirals, the top people in the fleet, people who were commanding all military in the Pacific for the U.S. Leonard told investigators these people slept with prostitutes that he put on and this kind of thing, and took gifts, and they weren't punished. And some admirals who were punished, they just got what are called censure letters, which are, basically slaps on the wrist for official. And in our final episode, which we call different spanks for different ranks, which is that term for, obviously more senior people get let off. We compare a guy who's just got out of jail, a commander who just got out of jail for his dalliances with Leonard, when he talks to us for the first time, since getting out of jail, to an admiral who's still very senior in the sort of Republican Party. He's a China hawk. And we compare what they did, and the commander's furious because he looks at the admiral and he thinks, well, what he did was very similar to what I did, and nothing happened to him. He's currently very senior in Washington policy circles.
And let's do that. What's his name? And who does he work for now?
Oh, so the admiral we're talking about is called Mark Montgomery. So Mark Montgomery is now head of a cyber security commission, and he works for a Washington conservative think tank. So he was reprimanded by the Navy in 2018 by the Navy Secretary with what's called a letter of censure, which says, it alleges that he improperly intervened to make sure that 2 Navy ships took fuel from Leonard when they had turned it down. And then Leonard on our podcast says, "Look, this is extremely valuable to me because this is, this is what was a place where I made money, was selling fuel. Not Leonard was obviously always overcharging." Sorry, the census letter also said, you took dinners from Leonard costing $35,000. You free hotel rooms for your family and all of this. And Montgomery responded to me for the podcast saying, "Well, I admit to my mistakes, but as I responded to the Navy, some of the other allegations were not backed up." But then he wasn't specific in his response to me about exactly what he thought was not backed up. And then David Capone, who is the commander who's just got out of jail in Hawaii he spent 18 months in jail. He was indicted. He had in his plea deal, it talks all about the prostitution, the fact that he took prostitutes from Leonard in Singapore and all of this, which was embarrassing to him. And he ends up doing 18 months in jail for failing to, on a technicality, basically, he pleads guilty to failing to mention Leonard on a security form. But he's like, he and many of the other people who pleaded guilty early on are really angry because they're looking back on what they did and they're wishing they hadn't pleaded guilty because, it doesn't look like senior most ranks of the Navy are getting into any serious trouble.
Tom, let's talk a little bit about your career. Jumping away from a cushy job in a legacy journalism media to start your own thing is not scary. I mean, presumably $1 Billion Whale sold well, but I don't think it necessarily sold well enough to allow you to sit on a beach for the rest of your life. What was your thinking? Talk a little bit about whale hunting, your new venture, and how you've ran this show and what you're thinking about doing for the next few years.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of my former colleagues think that you make so much money selling a best-selling. I mean, our book was a New York Times bestseller, but yeah, you don't. It doesn't change your life in terms of if you imagine how much work you have to put into doing a book like that and it being that successful. If you were a banker and you did a banking deal of such difficulty, that would be your payday for life. But no, it doesn't work like that. Obviously, you don't make the lion's share of. But it did definitely, it did give us enough, Bradley and I left the Journal. It gave us a little bit of a cushion and a passive income that means you can sort of take a bit of a risk, I guess. And so Bradley and I worked together at the Journal. We wrote $1 Billion Whale together. And then we decided to set up Project Brazen earlier this year in February. And Project Brazen is a company that's doing, true stories via either, podcasts, articles, documentaries, books, with the goal, with the stories that are focusing on stories that are adaptable into TV shows and films. So that's what we're doing. We've raised a bit of money to sort of fund it. We've raised a content fund, which we're going to deploy to sort of create IP, to buy IP. And we got a bunch of things, a really exciting slate of projects in the works. I'm based in Singapore. The company's based here, and Bradley's in London. It is, it is. I'm in my mid-40s, so it's a time to take a risk in life, I guess. And we think there's a great opportunity for it because there's such a boom in the demand for nonfiction content, right? There's all these streamers, all these different platforms all competing with each other. Everyone wants true stories. So, we're working very closely with a company called SK Global, which is making they made Crazy Rich Asians, and they're turning $1 Billion Whale into a TV show. And so we're working on that. And yeah, we're really excited. It's a great new venture for us.
All right, Tom. I don't think Hollywood's made a sort of mean movie showing the dark side of China that isn't like a one-person documentary in decades now. But we've had a number of ideas come up over the course of recording these past 200 China Talk episodes. My two favorite are the death of Mao. So you do sort of 75 to maybe 78, and you have Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four and that mess, and you sort of turn it into a Death of Stalin dark comedy. The other one is the Bo Xilai saga, which is just the absolutely craziest thing and deserves a Sopranos
treatment.
How can I get you to make them?
Absolutely no chance to either of them. I think one of the there's a couple of reasons why I wouldn't make either of those myself. I mean, it's not as if I've been working in Hollywood all my life, but I think you need stories that what we're looking for are stories that are absolutely globally applicable. So somebody, if you think about Fat Leonard, right? It could be, we're actually seeing it in the downloads of our podcast. It's downloading very well in Malaysia, in Australia, in Singapore. It was like we were top of the charts in Singapore, small market, but and then it's doing very well in the US and in the UK, right? And so we're hitting all these different markets, and that's really that's the key to business success, we believe, for Project Brazen, is to focus on stories which can sell. Everyone's talking about in Hollywood about how do you do the next money heist, how do you do the next Squid Games, and neither of those things were programmed to be globally successful. But is it possible to think about true stories in a way that you are hoping that happens? And if you think about it, like you're a China hand, you're a China speaker, your audience China hands. That the Gang of Four or Bo Xilai are not stories that are going to be very easy to. But Bo Xilai perhaps a little bit more, because you've got the whole, what's he called, Neil Haywood.
Yeah, I guess he's your sort of entry point, right?
Yeah, and he was a spy, perhaps he wasn't. He worked for Hacklet, right? The Bo Xilai's wife's a fascinating character. Actually, it connects to the Desmond. There's a part of the Desmond Shum book that really struck me, was where he says, "Oh, is it possible that Bo Xilai was the source of the leaks to the New York Times about Wen Jiabao?" Which just strikes me as like absolutely preposterous. But
Mike was like, "That's offensive. I do my own work."
Yes, exactly. Well, which is why I said, alarm bells went off when I read that, because I'm like, what? It doesn't strike me that that's true. There's the other issue that I heard the other day, that normally there are 37, 38 licenses given to foreign films into China every year, and this year only 17 have been granted, and so it's getting harder and harder and harder to get stuff to get Hollywood films to China. And the Bo Xilai story, if it was going to be popular anywhere, would be popular in China, right? But it's not
huge in China.
But no one's ever going to see it if you make it.
Yeah,
so that's the problem.
I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because like Netflix in particular, they are almost certainly never going to have a competitive mainland product, and they have made some really interesting Taiwanese movies, which aren't are dark, are exploring sort of like tricky parts of Taiwanese history, but none of those have risen to the level of like that Brad Pitt movie in the early 2000s where he's like saving Tibet. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, there were a number of Western made movies that portrayed the CCP in a really poor light, and I wonder if things get worse, if Netflix might end up, or if there's, because I feel like that's really the only studio that doesn't have any real sort of like downside risk if at a certain point they just decide to write off China entirely.
I think it's just getting harder and harder. I mean, I talked to movie executives just trying to get movies in, like the big tentpole movies, June or whatever, right? It's like even then you have to be careful. And like I said, only 17 movies made it this year. I think Disney have no movies in China this year or something. And then obviously the battle at Lake Changjin has broken all box office records, and and it's about. It's another film that's about sort of the North Korean War.
I'm not trying to sell my movie in China. I don't think that. I think that's that game is a little far. I mean, it's really funny, right? Because like the Legend of Shang-Chi, the Disney movie, which is the Marvel movie, which is half in Chinese, is still not being aired. But
right, and part of it's censorship, part of it's taste. I mean, Crazy Rich Asians did get into China and then didn't do that well, I think. And so I don't know. I mean, people have different tastes, right? But clearly it's just very hard to get into China. And then, but I mean, I know you're not pitching it for China, but the point is, if it's about China, that's your biggest market. You got like,
well, I mean, it's funny, right? Because like House of Cards was a huge hit in mainland China. And even the, even like a handful of Chinese officials, or like I think the US, like the ambassador to the US was like, I love this show. Like, it's so great. And you can only imagine. I shouldn't be the one to write this. Some Tyson journalist should be the one to write it.
But those were different times, weren't they?
Yeah,
in China.
That's fair. Anyways, maybe I'll put on a play. I'll give you tickets, Tom. Last thing, publishing a podcast without being on a broader network and having it go to #1 on the charts is not a straightforward thing to do. Can you talk a little bit about or I'm just curious, like, what was the sort of growth trajectory? Who was interested in this, and how it ended up getting momentum over time?
Oh, I pity my poor friends on social media and Facebook because, yeah, so we had to publicize it ourselves a lot, right? And the reason is we didn't partner with anybody. Well, we partnered with PRX, who are this great platform that, this is where This American Life has a home. And so you'll see on our posters, it's Project Brazen and PRX. And, we didn't want to, because our model is to turn what we're doing into TV shows or films or docu-series. It's very important for us to control the intellectual property. And if you go to, some of the other people, you can like Apple or Spotify or even Wondery, you're going to give up quite a lot of your IP. And so what we're trying to do is self-finance. We took debt to do this, and but we control 100% of the IP. But what that means is, I think there are like 2 million podcasts or something, some crazy number of podcasts out there. So to get any visibility, it's difficult. And especially when, Apple are not putting you up there as new and noteworthy or calling you podcast of the year or whatever, because you're not, you're sort of an independent. And the one way that we've gotten notice as well, I think, first of all, it sounds arrogant, but I think it's like a good story and it's interesting to listen to. So there's a word of mouth element to it, but also it's real time, right? Like a lot of podcasts are sort of set in the past, or it's about a murder from some time in the past. You have to really persuade someone to listen to it because it's a good story. Whereas this one, we're getting coverage in, we're on the front page of the LA Times the other day, San Diego Tribune. We were on like CBS Evening News at prime time, because this is a real time look at something that's still going on. The trials are still going on. Leonard still hasn't been sentenced. It's a cover up at the Navy. And so it creates some like almost like free marketing, and that helps for sure. And then we get onto podcasts like yours and other shows, and so the word of mouth is building for sure. But it's definitely hard work because there are just so many podcasts out there.
Tom, I hear you take pitches.
Yeah, I mean we're super open to anyone who's got a great story that they think the world needs to hear. The stories we're looking for are global, but rooted in a place, but also, with global appeal. Doesn't mean there has to be, the old days, you're always told as a journalist, what does the reader in Idaho or Kentucky think about it? We think that's old fashioned now, it doesn't have to be like that, but has to have themes that will resonate globally. But we are open to ideas, and we've got funding to fund projects. So, come ahead if you have a great story.
And so how does that work?
Oh, well, we will help people get things made. Yeah.
All right, Tom, let's stay in touch. And Tom's on Twitter at
Tom Wright Asia.
Best continent. At the end of every show, I let my guests pick the outro music. Any song you think fits with the Project Brazen outlook on the world?
So I have this, so Jolo actually, maybe I should send it to you if I can find it, but he actually recorded a song with Little John and others in the early 2000s where it was never released, but he paid for it to happen. And his role in the song is to go, very hot, very, very hot.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so we could get you that to you. There's also a song from the movie, is it called 22 Jump Street?
Yeah.
Where there's this line, Jolo, I see you, Jolo. Drinking miso at a party with Leo, never solo, referring to how Leonardo DiCaprio would turn up at Jolo's parties. So I think if there's a song that sort of encapsulates this whole corruption of the early, and the Leonard story is, the Fat Leonard story is the same time frame, right? We're talking about the aughts, right? Anything by LMFAO or Pitbull, that's the period. Cheesy dance anthems. That captures a lot of what's going on.
Tom Wright, thanks so much for being a part of Chinatown.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.